Welcome to Sustainability Talks here on businesstech.co.za, brought to you in partnership with RMB. Now, for much of the last decade, sustainable finance really has been dominated by one overriding question: how do we decarbonize the global economy? But in Africa, and particularly in South Africa, the deeper sustainability question is often a little bit more uncomfortable. It's about who's excluded from the economy in the first place. Now, that's where social financing comes in. It sits at the fault line. It's not about charity, it's not about CSI or well meaning grant funding. It's about whether financial systems can be redesigned to recognize value where it already exists but is systematically overlooked. Now, we've got informal income, we've got informal housing, we've got informal enterprise, entire markets that are operating in plain sight, yet they're priced as invisible. Township housing is certainly a case in point. Roughly 35% of South Africa's rental housing market sits in the informal sector, and demand has surged over the last 2 decades. The country faces a 2.6 million unit housing backlog, yet the people supplying that housing, often through backyard rentals, are routinely locked out of formal credit despite generating consistent cash flows. So today's conversation is really about what happens when finance stops treating that reality as a risk and starts treating it as an opportunity. And we're unpacking social financing through a bit of a case study with my guest today. We've got Indlu founder Kobus Tritter. Kobus, great to have you in studio with us. And we're also joined by Nikki Griffiths, who's a senior transactor at RMB. Nikki, maybe you could just kick us off here, because in South Africa, I think when we think of ESG, we always look at the E with the capital sometimes, and we talk about decarbonization and reducing emissions and net zero. And sometimes I think the S is even more important, yet it's a capital S. It's sometimes poorly understood and defined. So, how would you define social financing in the South African context?
So in our context, we're really looking at capital that's allocated towards solutions or activities that unlock social impact. I think in South Africa, everyone's very aware of the importance of social, and in Africa more broadly. And that conversation around how do we make sure that green doesn't dominate the agenda, I think is a conversation that's happening all around South Africa. We focus only as targets around social financing that we want to reach, because we know that the opportunity lies in finding those market-based solutions to some of the social challenges. And I think you can see in Indy's case, in many cases, when you see it as an opportunity, there's a real way that we can scale solutions to address systematic inequalities.
While earning a market-based and related return.
Yeah.
There must be huge opportunity in a country where we have such deep social challenges. If you, as entrepreneurs always do, Kobus, reframe those challenges as opportunities, which is exactly what you did with Indlu. Tell us a little bit more about your business model and how you came to recognize that there is this huge latent potential that is waiting to be unlocked in the township property entrepreneur.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. Yeah, we've been at this since 2009, where we recognize that the housing backlog is growing, and that the supply that was added to the market is not even sufficient to slow the acceleration in the demand. That obviously presents a big opportunity. And when we were looking into what is causing this, lack of access to capital came through as a major aspect to that. Underpinning that is also challenges in affordability in home loans. The counterbalance to that is the rental market. So because housing affordability has been under pressure and demand is growing, the rental market has really accelerated. But growth in demand far outstrips supply, and so the backlog keeps growing. So our model is basically trying to use the rental market to build affordability from a financing perspective. So our approach is to work with grassroots entrepreneurs, developers, landowners to really build an inclusive model. around this. The way we do it is by inviting entrepreneurs to join our Inlu Property Partnership program, where there is a sort of a capacity building roadmap for them. They come in and join the ecosystem at sort of various levels of experience and sophistication, and when we can really take them from a grassroots level and help them through the process.
And Nikki, coming back to you from RMB's perspective, I mean, it's clear to see that this can have a profound impact on the township economy and socially. But what did you like about the In-Bloom model when you decided to partner with a business like Cobus's?
I think it was a wonderful opportunity to think about a financing mechanism that is as innovative and as impact focused as a business. So I think when we met Inlu, we could completely buy into the vision, and not just the vision, I think the values that Inlu had and how they've been in this market and built a track record. In the social space, it's often difficult to always work out what the commercial return will be. And so we've had to look at what are blended finance mechanisms that we can use. And when we talk about blended finance, it's those kind of structures that allow for both concessional capital, whether it's grant capital or capital that'll have a below market return, and then commercial capital. And we're very clear, to achieve scale, you have to be able to tap into commercial capital. And how do we build mechanisms to attract different capital into the space while still honoring its mandates? And so what's been really exciting about Indu is that throughout the transaction, the focus on return and the focus on impact has never been lost. And it's really interesting when you meet different investors. They are really very discerning. They want to know how the funds are going to be tracked. They want transparency around impact. And Inglu is able to do that. I mean, they're able to tell you who they're affecting, who's got financing, what the ultimate impact will be. And I think the challenge for us was, how do we develop a mechanism that will support the ambition and the growth of Inglu and ultimately have an impact that we all want to see.
Just to stay with you for a second longer, because that is always the challenge, isn't it, with social. When you talk about ESG, it's very easy to measure, gigatons of carbon may be removed. A lot more challenging to measure some of the slightly more subjective or qualitative rather than quantitative outputs or outcomes in a social context, be it in education or housing or that kind of thing. Generally, how forgiving are investors when it comes to, the constraints that we have when it comes to measuring impact when it comes to social finance?
Yeah, I mean, I think investors are very discerning, and before you have to understand context.
Yeah.
There's a lot of nuance around social transactions. Social change doesn't operate on the same time frame as a financial year, or when investors expect dividends. And I think investors understand that, but they will buy into it if they believe that the intervention will have the impact that they want. It is difficult. What we see in social impact is trying to distill what are the one or two impacts that we can measure that are indicative of the broader change. And so they often take a lot longer to structure to get investors comfortable with what you are measuring and how to be measured and the frequency of the measurement. And then, to your point, each transaction in some way is customized. There is nuance where the transaction is taking place, the geography of the transaction. There's nuance in terms of who you're targeting. And so we see investors that are interested in social financing are willing to do that journey. They're willing to have the debate. They're willing to understand the complexity and the context. But also there is the economic reality of they have mandates themselves in terms of when they've got to return to their investors. And I think that is the magic of solutions like blended finance. How do you find that sweet spot where the allocators of capital can meet their mandates, but can also have an impact return at the same time? And so we rely often on, and I think what's really encouraging for us, we're seeing a lot of clients are developing models and designing models for social challenges where they see the opportunity. And so we really energize around supporting those type of models.
Yeah, well, and ultimately, I mean, if one takes a long enough time horizon, when business starts thinking like this, you unlock the economic potential of the country. If you're in early childhood development or education, developing the human capital, difficult to measure the outputs there, but over a long enough time frame, improving the human capital quotient of a country. If you look at what Ricardo Hausman and what they've done at the Harvard lab shows about long-term growth rates, you are going to have a net positive impact on economic growth rates. Coming back to Inlu, I mean, you've got something that's probably a little bit more tangible to measure. I might say a little bit easier to measure in terms of the social impact. Take me through what you're measuring, how you're doing that, and how important maybe the concessional capital is in now scaling the model.
I mean, you gave our main KPI in the intro, the housing backlog of 2.6 million. Now we've designed this business to be scalable, to try and make a dent in that number. So our first and most obvious measurable KPI is amount of affordable housing units supplied in the market. The second biggest one is because we're doing it in an inclusive manner, it's financial inclusion. So what is the capital? What's the capital value being dispersed to emerging developers and contractors?
Right.
So that's a rand amount. So that's very measurable. Then one layer down from that would be the job creation, which is also quite objectively measurable throughout the construction period, at least. And then it's quite I think accurate. We can then deduce the ongoing management employment that this will create in terms of property management, maintenance, in a manner that I think is very close to accurate. Where it gets a little bit more subjective is where we're trying to measure the business development and job creation further down in the value chain
Through construction.
Yeah, the suppliers to
Yeah.
the construction.
Right.
Because we're trying to prioritize local value chains as we want to create these sort of circular economies. We inject this capital through the construction process, which benefits the borrower, but that then directly flows into the local economy through the labor contractors and then the suppliers, brick makers. So we're building a whole ecosystem of micro enterprise that's supporting that's supporting this market, and it's ultimately underpinned by the rental market.
Fascinating. 2.6 million is a huge number
Yeah.
in terms of a backlog.
Yeah.
How long would it take South Africa to start making real inroads? And I'm sure Inlu wants to really be there at the sharp edge, but it looks rather daunting for them.
We've gone through a cycle. So like I said, a lot of people come up with solutions to problems where the solution doesn't even hold the potential of solving the problem. We're not like that. We from the start try to create something that is scalable, that can make a measurable dent. Capital participation in this market is definitely the biggest bottleneck, and we're confident that also working with R&B, that we're getting close to solving that. Coming back to one of your earlier questions around the concessional capital, we've really been impressed with the level of innovation from R&B side in terms of tackling this. In the past, starting up, we've almost had to make peace that we've got to develop what could be funded. We're not funding what should be developed,
Yeah.
And I must say, in this process, it's been the right way around. Like, what's the market? What's the opportunity? How is this going to scale? Let's design the capital solution for that. And in that, it's important that the availability of catalytic capital doesn't become your main constraint.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the flaw in a lot of the models. In our case, the catalytic capital is that it's catalytic. It's not required in the long run. It's sort of the alternator that starts the diesel engine, you know, and then we can grow from there. So we're very excited that we've got a solution that can really remove that main throttle point in the market.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, once that constraint is removed, you're very happy to open up your data and your learnings to others because the market potential is so large.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, the day we're starting competing for the same client, I mean, the demand side is certainly not a constraint in my lifetime. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the lessons just as we wrap up, Nikki, from Inloop, but from other social financing and funding projects that you've worked on. What have been the big lessons that you've learned so far in how to construct transactions and solutions that will ultimately lead to this kind of catalytic impact more broadly in South Africa? What would you say are a couple of the big learnings?
I think the first learning is no transaction is identical. I think in the social space, there has to be the flexibility and insight to construct a transaction that is relevant to the impact. I think if we get to a case where we are just implementing the same solution for different social challenges, we lose focus. The other lesson, I think it taps into that there's a consensus that all of us have a role to play when it comes to addressing social challenges. And we're seeing that traditional grant providers are more willing to be involved in more commercially orientated transactions. We see the state increasingly talking about blended finance transactions and how do we leverage private capital and private capacity to solve issues. And so I think it's less about lessons and more tapping into a broader trend that's happening. And, you know, the cut in donor funding, fiscal constraints, and people understand that everybody has to play a role, all capital providers, and we can't just leave it to the state to solve. And if we, thinking about a future that we all want to belong to, these are the type of solutions and financing mechanisms that we need.
Yeah, it's again thinking beyond just your own factory gate as well. And it's this whole society type approach. I think a lot of the capital constraints in the public sector, we know the on-balance sheet model of many state-owned enterprises has run its course. And so we're seeing space being opened up for the private sector in the network industries, most well known in Eskom and Transit, but all over there's this opportunity because, we had Curvis, a model to deliver RDP housing. And I don't want to get into the weeds of that, but it obviously also reached its own binding constraints. Just lastly, for you, what will success look like in a decade from now, looking back on your journey and what you started back in 2009?
I would like to see development in the townships approved. And I think one of the biggest things is looking at our partners. If our partners can become the major drivers of that, that would be a success, because that would be an inclusive growth model. So if the partners we're working right now can become the next big developers in the residential real estate space, that would be that would be a good moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nikki, for you as a bank, success for you, do we need a bit more policy certainty anywhere? Maybe reduced capital requirements for banks who are funding into this space, maybe putting solar as part of a funding solution on the roof of these entrepreneurs, and then they're not at the whim of these above average price increases from other providers in the market. There's so much that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our side is to increase the capital that's allocated to social impact.
Yeah.
To work with investors that are very focused on impact. And I think to your point earlier, to make sure that the S is never lost and that it remains part of the sustainable future that we all want.
Well, it's certainly not lost here on Sustainability Talks with RMB. Thank you very much, Nikki Griffiths and Curvis Trutter. Great pleasure having you in the studio and talking a little bit more about what I believe to be probably the most important part of ESG, but that's just my own personal opinion in South Africa. And it's an S with an absolute capital S when it comes to social financing. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. Much appreciated.